Kyle, wait, wait, wait. Wade gave me like a whole bio to read. Where is it? For you, I'm gonna do it. I'm not gonna do it. We've known each other a long time. Kyle was part of the Fat Lab show that was the first Gray Area Festival that was here in 2015. I don't think you spoke here, but I was trying to think. So that's a omission. We're like, through fate, are glad to remit right now. Works with code, has done a lot of projects on surveillance and integrating, interrogating technology and its sort of impact on our lives and society. And this new project, Amends, which he's going to talk about, we support it because it really thinks about how the new technologies that we're thinking about supporting new artist economies are also impacting, have material implications on our reality. So, Kyle.
Hi. That's me. I'm Kyle. My hair's a little longer now. Really happy to have been here at just the right time to substitute in. Cool. Yeah. So my work spans from really large-scale installations to very personal performances and conceptual work. This is Light Leaks, where I worked with Jonas Jongjan to project onto 50 disco balls and map every single reflection of light. I've also worked with composer Annie Lewandowski recently to create installations draped in recovered fishing gear, and we were using machine learning to generate lighting design that reveals the complex patterns in the songs of humpback whales, drawing attention to hundreds of thousands of whales that are killed every year by fishing gear. Besides my artwork, I also work as a technical and creative consultant. So for example, I helped Google build AI-powered instruments and music videos and visualizations. But for over a year, I've been researching the ecological impact of the Ethereum network. And Ethereum is one network that allows artists to sell certificates of ownership, which are also called non-fungible tokens or NFTs. Until a major change about 2 weeks ago called the merge, Ethereum was similar to Bitcoin in that it relied on a technique called proof of work that uses a really large amount of power. So proof of work is not energy hungry because it's complicated or because it's useful. Proof of work is just a process for generating random numbers. And it's only energy hungry because the price of the currency is tied to the cost of wasted electricity. So the network, Ethereum was powered by people called miners that basically waste energy in exchange for cryptocurrency. And when the price of Ethereum went up, then miners would waste more energy. And when it went down, they would turn off some portion of the 10 million computers that were powering the network. Most computational processes can be made more efficient with faster hardware or better algorithms, but not Ethereum. Not proof of work specifically. As an artist, I was trying to figure out like whether to work with NFTs. So I looked for reliable numbers on the energy use, but I couldn't really find any. They were either out of date or really contentious. So I did my own research and spoke with experts, and I wrote an article about what I learned. Some people told me, this is going to be too difficult, you can't do that, there's too many variables. But I wanted to show that, even though these systems seem really complicated, with some care we can kind of disentangle and understand them. I found that just before it transitioned away from proof of work, Ethereum was using around 22 terawatt hours a year, but no one really knows what a terawatt hour is. So for reference, the entire internet uses around 100 terawatt hours a year, the entire internet. So Ethereum was using more than 1/5 of the power compared to the entire internet. This is also, if you want to compare to other things, like you could say this is more than a small country like Iceland, which uses about 18 terawatt hours per year. Or you can compare to kind of centralized tech like Google and Facebook. So 22 terawatt hours is about the same as Google and Facebook combined. The difference though is that every second Google's answering around 50,000 searches and playing over 50,000 YouTube videos. And Ethereum in 1 second processes about 15 transactions. And this isn't renewable energy, so the emissions from this network are a bit like running multiple coal power plants. It's also, I just learned the other day, this is twice all of the emissions from all flights between New York and London. If you want to divide it up, like in terms of people, you could say this is about what 1.4 million people would emit around the world. Or if you look at like a really high energy hungry country like Saudi Arabia or the United States, that's about 400,000 people in 1 year. We're doing the same amount of emissions as Ethereum. The scale of electricity used by proof of work has been forcing countries from Kazakhstan to Canada to put restrictions on crypto. Last year, government officials in Sweden just called for an end to proof of work across all of Europe because they said it represents a threat to the climate transition. Fortunately, like I said, just 2 weeks ago on September 15th, Ethereum moved away from proof of work successfully. But even after this transition, I want to ask, when tech sort of like moves fast and breaks things, who picks up the pieces? When an industry moves on, why are the rest of us left with this big mess? You know, with CO2 in the atmosphere, with a warming planet, with rising seas, mountains of old GPUs. This isn't really sustainable, and I think we need to reimagine how tech is built and how we hold it accountable. And who do we hold accountable? Some people really want to focus on individual action, and of course it's really important to ask, you know, what can I do in my life? How can I contribute to this personally? But historically, it's also important to remember that individual action has been used as a deflection from corporate responsibility. So this idea of like a personal carbon footprint, you know, what on earth is a carbon footprint? This was actually an ad campaign by the advertising firm Ogilvy for the oil company BP in 2005. The entire concept of the personal carbon footprint was invented for the oil industry as a way to deflect responsibility away from them and onto individuals. So in the case of Ethereum, instead of blaming artists for, you know, having minted on this very high energy blockchain, I think it's good to look at the organizations that have been making the most profit, which includes the NFT marketplaces like OpenSea, Rarible, or Foundation, which each take a 5% cut of every sale, and they've been hesitant to engage with lower energy alternatives to Ethereum until now, when it's finally sort of like washed clean. So in my latest work, which is called Amends, I created a series of sculptures designed to mitigate emissions from these NFT marketplaces. There's one sculpture per marketplace, minted as an NFT, and the price is set at the cost of mitigating the emissions for that marketplace. The total cost to mitigate emissions from all three marketplaces is around $24 million for over 1 million tons of CO2. Amends went on sale when Ethereum transitioned away from proof of work, and I'm happy to be partnered with Gray Area, who's sponsoring the work by facilitating the sale and providing a lot of other guidance. And if the work sells, all of the profit from those sales will be split between 3 carbon mitigation companies I've partnered with. Each of them has different approaches to greenhouse gas removal and reduction. Now, if you know anything about carbon offsets, you know historically they've been abused by the biggest polluters to avoid making reductions. And many carbon offsets don't do what they claim to do. You know, they might be sold by some guy who says he was going to chop down a forest, even though he was never really planning on chopping it down. They might be sold by a corrupt government official who pockets most of the cash and then uses the leftovers to plant invasive monoculture trees that just destroy the local ecosystem. And then maybe even if that works, those trees and that whole forest might just burn down a few years later. But there is also essential work happening that can only really be funded by carbon offsets right now. And I want to share the work of the 3 partners behind Amends. So first is Nori. They're working with farmers who practice regenerative agriculture, which is basically by making key changes to the way that these farmers are farming, they can sink carbon dioxide into the soil. And this is a benefit for the climate, but it also is a benefit for the soil and for our health. Using cover crops and no-till farming techniques keeps these kind of soil microbes healthy and happy throughout the year, which increases the nutrients available to the plants. And these techniques also they create a kind of resilience, partially by decreasing reliance on inorganic chemical inputs, which are normally used for feeding the crops. And there's some kind of new science here that's still being understood better, but overall this approach is pretty ancient and known by many indigenous peoples already. Number 2, Project Vesta, they're researching this experimental process called enhanced coastal weathering. So on some beaches around the world, there's this green sand called olivine. And when ocean waves crash on these beaches, the olivine's chemically converted to something called bicarbonate, which is used by marine creatures to build their shells and exoskeletons and skeletons. And this process of converting from olivine to bicarbonate actually captures carbon dioxide from the ocean and in turn reduces the acidity of the water. And it turns out while there are only a few beaches that have this green sand, olivine is actually the most abundant mineral in the Earth's upper mantle. There's a lot of it. So Project Vesta is researching whether this naturally occurring process can be scaled up to capture a significant portion of historical CO2 emissions while also deacidifying the oceans. Trade water, number 3, they're dealing with a really different kind of historical debt, but has some parallels to sort of technological debt, like with Ethereum. So old air conditioning systems, like in old cars, they relied on these refrigerants like Freon, and when these gases escape into the atmosphere, they cause about 10,000 times more warming than CO2. And even though the worst of these gases were banned decades ago, the canisters that hold these gases are still sitting in warehouses and garages around the world, just kind of slowly rusting and weathering, and then eventually rusting through and leaking into the atmosphere. And trade water basically goes out and finds and destroys these canisters before they have the chance to leak. So each of these companies is doing really essential work. They're healing the soil, they're laying groundwork for future carbon removal with these research efforts, and they're also managing these dangerous gases like refrigerants. And ideally, we'd be able to fund their work even when we aren't trying to like offset emissions elsewhere. And this does happen sometimes. So for example, Tradewater told me about a tech company that purchased about 30 times the offsets on all of their emissions. And we could use a lot more of that. If amends doesn't sell, and after 2 weeks so far, it has none of them have, it will kind of remain a monument, I think, to inaction of the crypto ecosystem. But even if it does sell, I'm still cautious of NFTs for a few reasons I wanted to mention, independent from the ecological concerns. So the rate at which most art NFTs are flipped indicates they're being purchased mainly as financial instruments, similar to how the contemporary art market works. And you know, there's a place for the contemporary art market, but this really encourages collectors to engage with art as a kind of casino-style game. It reduces the art to its monetary value and artists to money printers. There's also things that are genuinely important for the digital arts that some people think NFT solves, but they don't really. So for example, NFTs are promoted as a solution for archiving media, but when you sell your artwork on an NFT marketplace, the only thing that's archived is the transaction history. It's like the receipt is archived. The media itself is stored on a separate server that may or may not one day disappear. NFTs are promoted as a solution for enforcing resale royalties, but in fact, they do not enforce resale royalties. NFTs are promoted as a solution for verifying authenticity, but in fact, fakes are everywhere. The entire ecosystem is designed on principles of deregulation, so there's nothing really stopping scammers from downloading anyone's digital art and selling it. And there's a lot of artists who have wasted their time fighting marketplaces to remove artwork that's being sold without their consent. And because the entire concept of the blockchain is that all the changes and additions should be irreversible, there are no undos. So even when a marketplace delists a stolen or fake artwork, the NFT persists and it can still be sold on other platforms. For me, one of the biggest concerns is that the entire crypto ecosystem decenters people. So on Web 2.0, at least we were like users, But with crypto, we're just wallets. And this means that if we want to build systems that redistribute wealth to people, or systems that allow people to vote, we don't really have a concept of people to work with. We can only redistribute wealth to wallets and let wallets vote with money. This is a complex, like, theoretical and practical problem that crypto has just not solved yet. We've also been told this moment represents like a major change, that we're going to see a decentralization of finance that radically favors individuals over corporate interests, and that this should help solve some of the biggest challenges we face today. And yet, these two biggest blockchain ecosystems, Bitcoin and Ethereum, spent years relying on this massively polluting technology of proof of work, with Ethereum only changing recently after 6 years, and Bitcoin with no plans to change its code. By the way, Bitcoin's about 4 times worse in all of these metrics in terms of energy use and emissions compared to Ethereum. So these blockchains have also seen buy-in from the same venture capitalists who brought us the web infrastructure that we use today. None of this is really simple, and we need to talk through it, which is why I've been running a series of group therapy sessions to discuss our feelings about and experiences with crypto and NFTs. And I think we need space to share our confusion, our excitement, frustration, financial anxiety, even changing friendships. You know, when you suddenly find out one of your friends is much, much wealthier than you, or they have different values than you do. I think this is going to be a moment of change, and this is the change I want to see. I want to see a reorientation towards healing the environment and ourselves, and a reliance on each other through mutual aid instead of reliance on markets and wealthy donors. And I want to see tech that's built by the people who are most impacted by that tech in a way that's truly accountable, instead of being built by developers and tech visionaries that walk away from all the mess and the broken pieces of their utopian dreams. Thank you. And I think we have a couple minutes for questions.
Yeah, hi guys. Thanks so much, Kyle. That was awesome. I have a question for you. So we're thinking about the future, and we're thinking about, of course, the title of the conference, Distant Early Warnings. And so from engaging in this really involved research, project, and also kind of being embedded in the social ecosystem that surrounds cryptocurrencies, and particularly these marketplaces, how do you see how do you understand Web3 to integrate into our lives in the coming years? You kind of have lived through and put out this work during a major technological change for Ethereum, and what also, at least culturally, feels like a social change related to this blockchain. So I would love to hear kind of some of your predictions, if you could look into the crystal ball.
That's, wow. I'm not a very good futurist, but I'll do my best. I haven't seen anything yet in the Web3 ecosystem that really signals mass adoption or mass utility. I think if something like that happens, then we might see some big change. But I think it's important to remember right now, all the hype around Web3 and crypto is really a very small, very vocal minority. It's not really like a Web 2 or a Web 1 where it just kind of started small and started getting bigger. I mean, Ethereum's been around for 6 years, and 6 years after, let's say, MySpace was the first version of Web 2, we already had, YouTube was the biggest website on the internet at that point, 6 years later. So we're not really seeing the same kind of, we're not seeing the same path kind of being tread by Web 3 if we see it as something being similar to Web 2. So it's really hard to predict that it's ever going to get much bigger than it is now. I think if there's something, like I said, that sort of signals mass adoption, like a wallet that works really well, or like a lot of websites integrating login through Web 3 or something like that, then we might see some other change.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's still really early, and I like that. Something that I think is really that you mentioned whenever talking about this. Especially when you were talking about the kind of branding surrounding carbon footprints. Is this really important shift from individual responsibility to either collective or corporate responsibility? And I was wondering if you could dial into that a little bit more, and why was switching that thinking so important for you as you were developing this project?
Yeah, you know, we're all in the arts here together. We're like trying to get to the other side of this somehow, whatever happens, like whether it turns out that all arts funding is somehow replaced with market-based Web3 economy, or whether it turns out that crypto is completely regulated away in some countries like it has been in China and kind of partially regulated in many other countries. Maybe it won't be here in the US anymore in a few years. Whatever happens, like we need to get through this together. And I guess I felt early on in this climate discussion about crypto that we were sort of tearing apart at the seams. And when artists are fighting against other artists and against art institutions, we all lose. And we need to figure out, like, not necessarily about like who's individually doing something wrong. We need to figure out like who has power and interrogate power instead. And I think reading more about the climate movement and understanding historically like how like the problems that they've dealt with helped me realize like, oh, this is just a smaller version of that. And we can learn from those lessons, which is basically one of the biggest lessons from the climate movement is to like not fight for purity. Like don't blame people for not being pure, because then the movement just falls apart.
Thank you so much, Kyle. Really appreciate you
Thanks.
being here today.